26 points, 26 points, 22 points, 21 points, and 17 points. Those were your top 5 kickers in week 1 fantasy football. And a couple of those, you probably didn't even draft them. And there was a total of 15 kickers with double-digit fantasy football points. So the next time somebody tells you kickers don't matter in fantasy football, tell them up yours, because they totally matter. And that's exactly why I do kicker rankings every single week. And I'm the only fantasy football YouTuber who does kicker rankings every single week. So please go down there and drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support before we get into these top 12 kickers. Now let's go down here and go through the first tier of guys, Brandon Aubrey and Tyler Bass this week. Now with Brandon Aubrey against the New Orleans Saints, this is a matchup that I think is going to be very good for Brandon Aubrey. So number one, Brandon Aubrey is an elite kicker. Like, he joined the Cowboys last year. Nobody knew who he was. This dude came out and showed everybody, not only does he have an extremely strong leg, probably one of the strongest in the league, if not the strongest. He also came out here and was extremely accurate. Last week, I don't know if you knew this, last week, that dude hit a 66-yarder before half. The problem was the Cowboys couldn't get the freaking playoff in time. So that kick didn't even count. It was 66 total yards. Brandon Aubrey is an absolute stud of a kicker. And I think in this matchup, New Orleans will put up enough of a fight defensively to where the Cowboys have to kick a couple of field goals. It's going to be similar to that Browns game. They're going to win the game, and they're going to get touchdowns, but they will kick in a couple of field goals as well. That's why Brandon Aubrey's at number 1. And then number 2 with Tyler Bass, I love a good divisional matchup for a kicker. Divisional matchups for kickers are like honey for bees. I love these matchups for kickers because the reality is a lot of field goals will be had in this Buffalo-Miami game. And Miami opened up as home favorites in this game. I actually think Buffalo is going to win this game, but the reality is that Tyler Bass, I think, is actually going to see more field goal opportunities this year than he did last year. Just the reality with the lack of weapons in Buffalo, it's going to make it tougher for them to convert all the time when they're inside the 20, when they're inside the 30. That'll leave kicks open for Tyler Bass. And I think that's what we'll see this week against the Miami defense that's not particularly great. But tonight I think you will see just the reality of divisional opponents, and that is that these games are tougher, and they typically do not include tons of offensive efficiency just because the other defense knows the other offense really well. Now, dropping out to our next kicker right here, I've got Jake Moody at 3 and Jason Sanders at 4. Now, with Jake Moody going to the Minnesota Vikings to take on the Vikings this week, and Jake Moody was incredible last week. 26 fantasy points. He was the number 1 kicker alongside Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He kicked 6 field goals, made all 6 of them. Last year, he actually had problems with accuracy. He was right on the money last week against the Jets. 53-yard long was his long. And I think this week they'll probably have a very similar game where it's like they're going to have plenty of offensive success regardless of who they play. This week against the Vikings defense, it's probably going to be a very similar matchup though. I really don't see a ton of change from last week. They're going to get down there very consistently by Jordan Mason plays, Brandon Ayuk plays, Debo plays, Kittle plays, you name it. They'll get down there plenty of times. But there will be opportunities for Jake Moody to score field goals. Because against the Jets, like, he had so many opportunities because they were just constantly going down there and scoring points. So I think it's very similar this week for Jake Moody. And then Jason Sanders, again, divisional matchup I want in. Now, Jason Sanders obviously makes headlines because he hits the game winner last week, buzzer beater versus the Jacksonville Jaguars to put them over the top. Ended up having 10 fantasy points. Dude missed an ugly field goal attempt though. And that's kind of been my problem with Jason Sanders. That's why he's not in the same tier as Tyler Bass. Because I think almost every week you can kind of bake in a miss for Jake Sanders. He missed a lot of field goals last year. Jason Sanders just is not the most accurate guy. So I don't always trust him in these types of matchups here. But again, against Buffalo's defense, they're going to be able to get down there in range for Jason Sanders to have plenty of opportunities to redeem himself for a better week this week. Now, our next guy is Harrison Butker at number 5. Versus the Cincinnati Bengals, I actually contemplated putting him lower because, as you know, with kickers in fantasy football, you want kickers who have an offense that's good enough to get them down there, but not good enough to always punch it in. Now, the Chiefs this week, I think they'll punch it in with ease, but I actually just think they're going to score a lot of points. So even if it's like 5 extra point attempts and he makes all 5, that's 5 points. Give him 1 30-yarder, that's 8 points right there. So I think Harrison Butker does have still a good chance to be a good fantasy kicker this week. But ultimately, I can see myself pushing him down even in the next day or two just because of the matchup here. I do think they're not going to have problems scoring touchdowns in this game against a weak Bengals defense. Now, dropping down to our next tier right here, we've got Cameron Dicker at the Carolina Panthers. I went through it on my live stream last night. I kind of said to people, Dicker may not be as high as you would expect him to be. Obviously, based on last week, he was incredible too. Cameron Dicker, 12 points, hit every kick, 3 field goal attempts. Cameron Dicker, I think they're just going to have too much offensive success for him to be much higher than this. The Panthers are atrocious. They're atrocious. Their best defensive player, Derek Brown, out for the year now. I think they're going to have zero problems at all getting in the end zone. Now, the Chargers offense is probably not as good enough to get them down there every single time to score a touchdown, but so that's why I do think that he will kick like 2 or 3 field goal attempts in this game. But I do think that they'll have more extra point attempts this week than they will have field goal kicks. That's why he's down here a little bit lower than you'd expect. Kaimi Fairbairn this week, taking on the Chicago Bears in Houston on Sunday night. And Kaimi Fairbairn was excellent. 17 fantasy points last week, made every kick, including a 51-yarder last week. So Kaimi Fairbairn, we know this guy's got the leg. Last year was kind of a bad year for him because he missed time with an injury. He actually got put on IR, but he came out with a vengeance last week. He came out ready to kick, and he was kicking very, very well. So with this matchup against the Bears defense, I actually kind of like this matchup because the Bears defense is pretty good. Like, they did really well against they were the reason they won the game last week. That was the reason the Bears ended up pulling out that victory, was because of their defense. So I think that their defense, a couple stops on the Texans is kind of all you need for Kaimi Fairbairn to hit like a couple 20 or 30 yarders or maybe 40 yarders as well. So in addition to the extra points he'll get, he's also going to get plenty of field goal opportunities against a strong defense. Now, Chris Boswell and Will Lutz are my 8 and 9. They're in the same exact matchup. Broncos taking on the Steelers at home. And Chris Boswell shared the top position last week with Jake Moody. 26 fantasy points, 6 field goal attempts, no extra points. That's probably going to see what you're going to see a lot from the Steelers in their upper tier games. And this is a game I don't particularly love as much as I did last week with Boswell. I think Boswell's a great kicker. I've been watching the Steelers my entire life. I'm a Yinzer at heart, but fantasy analysis comes first. This offense is taking on a much tougher defense in a much tougher environment in this league. Last week, there was like a home game. If you watched that game, there were Steelers fans infiltrating the Falcons Stadium. That was almost a home game. Denver, it's not going to be like that. Much more hostile environment, much tougher to move the ball. So Chris Boswell probably gets lucky to have 3 or 4 field goal attempts, which he will all make. And Will Lutz, I just think that it's a similar situation, except I can actually see the Broncos getting a touchdown or 2 in this game. I think they'll actually put up more points than the Pittsburgh Steelers will in this game, and they'll win the game and probably leave Will Lutz with good field goal opportunities. I just think he'll probably have an opportunity to score another touchdown or 2 and less field goal attempts than Chris Boswell will. So that's the reason I put him below Chris Boswell at 9. Now, dropping down to our next kicker, I've got Chase McLaughlin in our next tier at the Detroit Lions. So Chase McLaughlin last week had a great week as well. The Buccaneers housed the Commanders, and Chase McLaughlin had 15 fantasy points, was perfect on every single kick. 3 field goal attempts, and 4 extra points. Made every single one of them. So with Chase McLaughlin, we kind of know that he's a really good kicker at this point. He ended the last year strong. He kicked a 56-yarder to open up in week 1. So we know this guy's got the leg, and his accuracy has improved based on the beginning of last year at the very least. So with this matchup against the Detroit Lions, it's going to be a tough one. In Detroit's house, in week 2, it's a divisional round matchup from the playoffs last year. Chase McLaughlin probably in line for probably more field goal attempts this week, but maybe not as many touchdowns, because I do think Detroit wins this game, and I do think that Tampa Bay could be competitive for the first 2 or 3 quarters, but I ultimately do think it'll go similar to what it did in the playoffs last year, which is what Detroit will end up winning this game pretty decidedly. So Chase McLaughlin probably just doesn't have as many opportunities this week as he did last week. Now, Justin Tucker at 11 here versus the Raiders is all just because I think that the Raiders are going to get clobbered. I think the Raiders are going to get the redheaded stepchild treatment. They're going to get absolutely crushed because the Ravens are pissed because they lost to the Chiefs. And the Ravens played a pretty good game. So, Justin Tucker last week didn't have as many field goal opportunities as I thought he might have had, but he wasn't a bad play. He still had 8 fantasy points. He did miss a kick, though. A kick he usually makes. That was my problem with him last year at the start of the year, is he did miss a couple of those. So with Justin Tucker, this week, I think the vibes are different. It's in Baltimore. It's an easier opponent. I think Justin Tucker probably kicks like 5 or 6 extra point attempts in this game and maybe a field goal. That's why he's down a little bit lower. And then to round it out at 12, Cairo Santos taking on the Houston Texans in Houston this week. Now, Cairo Santos last week obviously had a good week as well. Wasn't one of the top guys, but Cairo Santos ended up getting 13 fantasy points. Great kicker, played a great game. Cairo Santos taking on the Texans. Less opportunities for them to score. Less opportunities for them to get down there in the end zone. And that's, something I probably just overlooked. Caleb Williams looked like a rookie. He looked like a rookie against the Tennessee Titans of all teams. So going to Houston on Sunday night in a big spot, I don't love his chances of improvement too much this week, which is why Cairo Santos is lower this week than he probably will be in a lot of other weeks. And speaking of sure things, Underdog went live with their CeeDee Lamb free pick at higher or lower half a total yard against the New Orleans Saints this week. So obviously it's a fantastic free pick to get in on. If you're not in on Underdog yet, use that link down there in the comments. And when you use code FN to sign up for Underdog, they'll match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash, and you'll be able to take advantage of the free line. So go down there, use the link in the comments, and use code FN to sign up for Underdog. And let me know how your team is turning out this week. And if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for week 2 fantasy football, click on this video right here.